All right. I am going to convince you that Arcane is actually Shakespeare. Well, Thomas Kyd, but you lot aren't cultured yet, and I'm going to get you there. So we'll get you to the point where you understand it's Thomas Kyd, not Shakespeare, but that will be the end of the video. For now, it's Shakespeare. Understand that Thomas Kyd will be coming later. Or we can title it, Let's Learn About Revenge Tragedy, because it's bloody cool. Arcane is a phenomenal show. It is fantastically animated, really rich with characters and stories, and um, very visceral and philosophically and politically interesting storylines and character arcs that have led to a lot of discussion and love and hate for various characters who go on slightly frustrating and despair-inducing arcs across 2 seasons that have so much fun. And as of recording of this video, we are looking at episode 6 of season 2 having been released. The next 3 episodes will be releasing not very long. This is being recorded quite late at night. Dark lighting going on. But the point still stands that Arcane kind of draws on some really interesting roots because at its core, for me, it is a revenge tragedy. And that is a genre that has some really rich and really deep literary roots all the way back to Elizabethan England, rather, way beyond back to the Romans and Seneca history lessons. But that means I want to teach you all a little bit about what revenge tragedies are because they've got some really cool and interesting pillars and tropes that Arcane is really heavily relying on to dramatically influence the decisions that have gone into the creation of the show. And by the time you're done, you understand exactly where I'm coming from. Thomas Kyd is there at the top of your screen alongside Shakespeare thumbnails. But let's on. I have the credentials to talk about. Trust me, I know what I'm doing. There's the source. Yeah, no. Camera around, and we'll go from there because that'll do. I have a BA in English. Did a lot of Shakespeare. I did a 7-hour Shakespeare exam. 7 hours. It was bloody long. I did quite well in it. I was also an English teacher for a bit. It was mostly teaching English language as a foreign language out in Japan and stuff. I was an English teacher, so it counts. I've also done an MA, game design and theory. Half of that was making games. The other half of that was academic stuff around what goes into the philosophy and sociology and academic rigor of games. It's looking at like Arset and Huizinga and lots of other cool um, authors and thought leaders in how the hell you make games and games as a literary and dramatic medium, not just as something you play, but something you get value out of in a literary sense as well, which helps when we're doing videos like this. And on top of that, I am a caster. You may well know me as Initialize, which will be the name of this YouTube channel. I've not actually introduced myself. Hi, I'm Initialize. I do the casting of League of Legends quite regularly. Been on LEC, you may have seen me there. I've done EMEA Masters. I've been on NLC. I've done LPL co-streaming with Nymera, who you may also recognize. Looks quite a lot like Victor. Also, my brother in asleep in the other room, so I'm hoping I'm not waking up during this video. But this is all to say, I have actually got pretty strong credentials to be talking about Arcane from a literary view. Mom, who the hell is Thomas Kyd, and why was I bringing him up in the beginning video? Right back where it was. There we go. Because this is going to be really important. I need to offer some context as to why revenge tragedies are a thing and why Thomas Kyd is important. And that will either offer us the context to talk about it to Kane. Because he was a playwright writing for about 15 in London, alongside a few people you might recognize, like Shakespeare and Christopher Marlowe, who wrote some pretty plays. Importantly, Thomas Kyd wrote what was probably the first ever smash hit for the stage. It was by far the biggest populist hit of the time, a play called Spanish Tragedy. That and a play called Tamburlaine from Christopher Marlowe, which really led to this huge swell in popularity for plays and led to that kind of golden age of theatre. And there's some arguments about that, and that perhaps is. But the important part here, because it created a new genre, the revenge tragedy. And those literary buffs who are out there listening to this and going, well, what about Seneca? You're right, Seneca did it years and years and years ago in the Roman Republic, but we're not talking about him today, though Thomas Kyd very much was inspired by things Seneca and the Roman Senecan tragedies. But Kyd really took what he did and um, synthesized and took it on further. Some glorious evolution, if you of what it meant to do revenge tragedy, and it's certainly a very different look to Seneca, even if there's very much there too. Here are some tragedy as I have to move the camera again. I think I'd have planned. Here we are. According to Kyd, that's why we're talking about him because he wrote the book on it, quite literally. Here's what goes into a revenge tragedy, and this is what we'll be using to have a look at Arcane because I think you're going to recognize pretty much all of these from within the show. Namely, that according to Kyd, we'll find that a murder has been committed. Vengeance is required. May have seen a few of those. Person or persons take up the quest for vengeance. Again, might be ringing a few bells right now. People are haunted, often literally by ghosts, and well, maybe is a little bit more interesting, but we'll come to that. And there's another side of this as well, which can be omens. So if you think like Macbeth, the witches offer omens and prophecies to Macbeth, and that leads to some interesting choices for vengeance and their own self-destruction and the course of fate and all those things. But anyway, that can also count within that particular category slash trope. An interesting one is Machiavellian villains who cause a pandemic of bloodshed whilst introducing newfangled torture horrors. What a quote that is. Objects of revenge are often better than the Avengers. Again, recognizing that some characters grow or to become mad or feign madness in the first place. There's a play within a play quite regularly. This is sometimes defined as metatheatricality, which basically means things like breaking the fourth, playing with what it means to be a play and how aware people within the play are that it's not actually real life and is actually that. Detail, the last bit, is lots and lots and lots of gratuitous violence. Revenge tragedies are notoriously bloody. A really good example is Titus Andronicus from Shakespeare. 5.1 atrocities an act, some of them so vile and heinous. I do not think I can talk about them here, lest I get in trouble on some platforms. But if you want to subject yourself to a very entertaining, if grim time, go read it. It is truly pretty ridiculous how many awful things happen to people. But let's go on, see how it applies to Arcane. And let's start with number one on the list, namely murder. I'm not going to spend too long here. It should be pretty self-evident, guys. Lots of people are murdered within this. Vander is murdered. Jinx does a lot of murdering. Jace accidentally murders a kid. We can go down that list as to who does it. And of course, season 2 starts. One of those murders that calls out for vengeance. Caitlyn's mother, the Karaman, dies, and Caitlyn, much of season 2 is set on a quest of vengeance against Jinx horrors subjected Piltover to, and in doing so, perhaps does end up creating a few more horrors of her own down. Dawn will know how those murders start, where that quest of vengeance originated is very, very obviously there in episode 1. That side of that leads on to that quest for vengeance. Personal persons take up the quest for vengeance. Literally the A-team squad that Caitlyn sets up with her Hextech weapons to go and hunt down Jinx alongside Vi, who's looking for her sister, and they go on this big quest for vengeance. But it's not, of course, just Caitlyn. Silco does it well. Obviously, in season 1, he deliberately sets up Bandit, gets Powder on his team to go on this quest for vengeance against the Topsiders to set up for his great, glorious freedom for Zorn at the extreme cost. And I think episode 3 of the first season does. Yeah, I think that itself. Another good example here, Vi and Jace, again in season 1, after Silco starts using Shimmer to do pretty unspeakable things. They go to try and destroy his manufactory, strike a blow back against him in glorious acts of vengeance. They run into all these Chemtech. Turbo Chemtech. I forgot what the name of that item was in League of Legends. It was an item in League of Legends for those who don't play. And then they removed it because it was too strong. But anyway, they go on this big vengeance. Jace ends up killing a kid. It's all a bit of a mess. Unaliving a kid. And we end up in a position again, that quest for vengeance, supposedly righteous at the hands of murders that Silco commits. Slightly awry, shall we say. Next on the list. The Haunted. Often literally by ghosts. This one's a bit more interesting enough. I think those first two were pretty self-explanatory as far as the genre conventions of tragedy and arcane. People being haunted, I think this one is a little bit different. You don't have a Hamlet ghost in this. You don't have a Spanish tragedy ghost where you have the literal spirit of revenge and a dead Spaniard crying out for vengeance as they fight each other. That is that play. But you do get hints of it in a sense. This is Jinx struggling to let ways across season 2 in particular. Choices she has made, because she's on the other side of vengeance. She breaks at the end of season 1, blows up the council, which blows up any hope of peace between cities. Independent zone, which Silco had so hard to get, unspeakable to do for it. Amanda would have leads to the death of her father, that leads to so many different things, and as a result, her choices leave her hollow and haunted. Silco there. Anyways, his absence is as much a presence as a would have been. A lot of Jinx's early arc to the story is, what do you perhaps a little revenge tragedy, but that's in some ways another part of Arcane is that the cycle keeps continuing, that there is just another tragedy happening that will take over from. There are some other ghosts though. This one is, I think, a little. This, for those who don't recognize, is one of those zany, psychedelic, hex tech core scenes that Victor goes on with Sky, who, of course, is a lab assistant who is clearly in love with Victor, or certainly interested in him, and she ends up being absorbed, killed, something by the hex core, and Victor, as a result of the transformation he season 2, ends up being able to commune with Sky, who he can hear and speak to, who is there guiding him along in some pretty unusual ways, like literally glowing footpaths, find his way down towards the end. The Shimmer addicts that then goes on to try and help that kind of commune in the Undercity, sort of connecting them all together in some great jest out mind on the glorious evolution. And that's an interesting one. Again, he's haunted there by a ghost, most literal one we have within the show, but it's not really on a quest for vengeance, and it's on a quest for peace. Realistically, in a lot of ways, it's looking for harmony. Very much the antithesis, in some ways, of what a revenge tragedy. That is quite interesting in its own right. And of course, a reminder: this video is being filmed after the end of episode 6, but before 7, 8, 9, and the conclusion of the show has come down. Obviously, we've still got some stuff with Jace. It's a very different Hextech experience to Victor, who might well have some different things to say about whether Sky is leading Victor down a good path. But still, hauntings within the show, regardless, even if they are decoupled from vengeance. The last one, of course, which I think is the most interesting of all, most directly to revenge tragedies in some ways, is Kino here. Kino, for those who do not know, is the son of Ambessa, the brother of Mel, who was kidnapped by the Black Rose, killed by the Black Rose, perhaps, many years ago, and is the catalyst for Ambessa's own arc of revenge. And characters on that great quest for vengeance. Unspeakable things happening, and perhaps is the preeminent character in that regard closely. But for now, we want to focus on Kino, because Kino's interesting. This is actually Kino. It's not. It's a facsimile. It's a fake. It is, at the very least, in some capacity, perhaps now beholden to the Black Rose attempt to manipulate his sister, secrets of her power that she knows about at this point, and we as the audience know very little about this point. And again, episode 6, it's a great point we're at when this video is being recorded, and it's unusual. for revenge tragedy. 'Cause it plays straight into the tropes in so many ways. Someone sending you on a quest against the Black Rose and looking for um, justice for themselves. Of course, at this point, dead. He's a real person, but you've still got this kind of character who has disappeared and come back and is now asking things of you. This time to solve this puzzle, make sure you know what's happening and get us out of here, type thing. And it's not telling the truth. It's not telling the truth. He is there to manipulate them, there to lead her down a path she shouldn't go. Nearly invariably within, actually, at least a traditional one, those ghosts are impartial and largely truthful. They are telling the truth. I have been killed. Get vengeance for me, whatever the cost. Not necessarily good, but they are telling you the truth. They are impartial. They are pretty upfront with who and what they are and what they are asking. Anything but the case. This is unusual because it lies. It doesn't tell. Doesn't tell whatever the thing is. It is really a way to manipulate and play the games of Black Rose who are hunting what it is that makes Mel's power tick. That, I think, is quite interesting and mess some of those. Cool. And speaking of the Black Rose, um, Machiavellian villains. There we go. Smooth transition. I'll need to move my camera back up a second. League of Legends players will know exactly why the character who is the background character. Her name is LeBlanc. We'll come back to her later. Don't worry about it. To those who are not League of Legends players, just Arcane enjoyers, suffice it to say, she is the quintessential Machiavellian villain within the League of Legends universe, and she is wonderful. She's a great character. But we'll be coming back to her properly in a little bit. Suffice to say, the Machiavellian villains are people within the context of revenge strategy who cause a great pandemic of bloodshed whilst introducing newfangled tools. Quote it is. Um, Before we do go too much further, I do actually want to find what Machiavellian is, because it's another one of those terms that gets bandied around a lot. And it is pretty core here. So as we've kind of defined what makes a revenge tragedy tick, how Arcane falls into it, I do want to make sure that we understand what the hell Machiavellian is. Machiavellian comes from Niccolo Machiavelli, who was an Italian author writing around when you had a lot of the Italian city-states vying for power, so Florence and Venice and all those various super important, super wealthy city-states, Assassin's Creed 2 style. And he wrote this book, Prince. It was effectively a primer and instruction manual to new princes looking to gain and consolidate their power within the context of the Italian city scene. And to do so, Machiavelli, within this book, advocated for doing whatever it took to gain and hold and ensure political power, um, whatever the cost. And basically argued that ethics were irrelevant, or rather, the good thing to do was to gain power using political power by whatever means necessary, and all those other little things like ethics and the wellness of the people around you were irrelevant, with as long as that was the end goal. And for me, I think the book is somewhat satirical. A lot of other people didn't think so, though. And so these kind of concept of villains who are willing to do whatever it takes to gain and hold political power, pull all the strings, be as unscrupulous and unethical and amoral as you can be, comes from the source of the book. And Blanc come to quintessential Machiavellian villain. We get there. I need to get over. Do another one of those again. For season 1, it's Silco. Pretty obviously Silco. And of course, he ends up subverting it because by the time season 1 is done, all those strings he's pulled to kill Vander, take his daughter and fashion her into a weapon to lead Zorn to the position of power. He runs this giant coup to take over the city and install himself as his power leader and get all these sort of chem barons around him that he kind of controls through strength of arm and political aim, political, um, better term for this, political machinations. There we'll go. We'll stick with that. All falls apart by the time the season is done because he realizes he quite loves Jinx, wants better for her, sees what Vanda was striving for in uh, independent Zorn that gone to better things, despite the fact that he had brought Shimmer to the streets and used it to enthrall the underclass of Zorn and bring them to their knees, to use it to give himself all of this power and money and wealth and chemtech weapons in order to fight against Piltover at the cost of Zorn's people, really. Those Machiavellian aims that the ends justify the means, that political, practical power, he ends up undercutting it. The end decides he wants things. And perhaps I think there is an argument to be said for that in letting slip that iron grip of political power at any end, being at the expense of those close to you, he sets the scene for his own demise because that castle of sand he has built, way Jinx, his own daughter, the person he loves more than anything else in the world, is the one who kills him, and she counsel does that potential for an dawn on and barons fall to infighting, and that whole empire he built crumbles in a moment. Perhaps an interesting fate for the Machiavellian villain, especially when they decide they'd rather not be a villain. Uh, Season 2 has to be Ambessa, doesn't it? You see it all over the place. She is playing Piltover and Zorn against each other. Noxus in general is playing Piltover and Zorn against each other. We get hints of it in Season 1. Mel's very aware of it. She's very afraid of it. She knows what her mother is capable of. And for all that she very visibly portrays those two ideals of Noxian strength in and farms and then strength of vision that she talks about, there is that third element to the trifecta, which is strength of guile. We have a conversation with Caitlin when that dueling scene on top inside of Ambassador, where she has that conversation about what those three um, cornerstones of Noxian ideology are. Very Machiavellian in their own right, Anoxis, but Ambessa is very obviously very forward-facingly representing two of those. But it's the third one I think that is most dangerous for that sense of guile, because of course here this is a screen of her thumping her chest alongside the Noxian soldiers and setting Caitlin up as the commander of the Noxian enforcers and tasking her with shutting down Zorn and the insurrection's Jinx, sets her and pushes her on that path to vengeance. And yes, Caitlin makes her own choices, but be sure that Ambessa is behind her, encouraging her along her way. And of course, the fact that Caitlin pulls away from those strings that Ambessa has so deliberately set up is interesting. The other side of that is that Rictus, her second in command, is sent with a letter down. Tell this delightful character turn up to Memorial in episode 1 and cause some vengeance. What's that? Parent, the kid that Jace murders, and accidentally or not, when they go to shut down the Shimmer factories. Cycle of vengeance that over and over and over again in Arcane, being manipulated and pulled apart. All of that bloodshed and newfangled torture we're talking about at the hands of Essa, because of course willing to do whatever it takes to get power to fight against the Black Rose, who has taken her son. Make sure that Mela's safe as well. Family before anything. Political power necessarily that is her end goal, but it is family, and the political power is what she needs to make that happen. So she will sacrifice Piltover and Zor, fire of those. Do it to try and get a hold of Hextech in all the madness as she gains power, as she looks to find ways to combat the Black Rose that had terrified her across this series and beyond. Hints of that will come later. Like Caitlin being an ally, trying to get a hold of Hextech. Of course, this screenshot trying to make sure that Singed here is great monstrous mutated beast monsters that you create, like Vanda, who Warwick, not Warwick, it's Warwick. I'm British. I'm sorry, I refuse to say Warwick. Could be provided. Aims to bring down this additional villain, and again, whatever it takes to make. But of course, she's doing it because she needs to try and take down the arch Machiavellian villain, which of course is LeBlanc. We don't see her in Arcane, or at least we haven't as of episode 6. We might. We might. But LeBlanc is the mistress of the Black Rose, and she's been alive for a very, very long. Been around basically since the start of the League of Legends timeline, millennia ago. She is one of the great powers in Noxus, largely in charge of Noxus behind the scenes by pulling on the strings of the previous Emperor, Aurum Darkwill, before Swain, who was another one of LeBlanc's puppet slash tool, kind of ends up taking over from Darkwill and forming kind of new era of Noxus and becoming something of a nemesis to her, even if there's some suggestions that she might be, by proxy or not, that third seat on the Council of Noxus alongside Darius and Swain. She is the one behind the Black Rose, is what you get behind and get to understand for those of you who don't play the game. All of those additional agents and weird magical shenanigans all hold their roots in Bonk. She is quite something, and this is what Ambessa is fighting against. And we've only got hints of her actions. We see it in her abduction of Mel, in the fear she instills Ambessa in having stolen away Kino or killed Kino. We don't really know what her aims are. We know that there is an additional villain behind Ambessa who is kind of a rival. Realistically, bit too much for Ambessa to handle with the thought process, but there is just that additional villain behind the villain, someone we need to keep our eyes on in the grander scheme of things, because Blanc is, to put it bluntly, a mean character and capable of things, and another one of those people willing to do whatever it takes in order to secure the safety of not just Noxus, but the world in some ways. Got Mordekaiser another time for those find out a bit more. But this is what Ambessa is fighting against. This is the head of the Black Rose, who is that additional factor at play in the underbelly built over. Find out exactly what heck is going on with Hextech and Mel and other things. And hopefully we get a bit more of that explained in 789. Maybe this slide could have used some more information. But alas, those episodes hadn't come out. There you go. Our additional Machiavellian villain, the queen of them, the arch villain. There is itself. Next step is the quest for vengeance makes us, or perhaps more as Kyd put it, that basically objects of revenge are often better than the Avengers. The quest for vengeance makes you work. We see it everywhere. See it, we see it everywhere you look. A lot of those parallels have show. It's very true in revenge tragedies. It's played a little bit more interestingly in Arcane because everybody ends up as they set off on their object of revenge here and kind of cross uh, streams, I suppose. We'll go with the Ghostbusters reference now. And Jinx here, as we can see, is an interesting one. Of course, in some ways, she was Silco's. It was a weapon at the start and becomes, and he trying to save her, Shimmer and her body, that weapon that he also used to fall and power in Dawn and addict the populace and all the weapons, breaks Jinx's mind, more unstable, having to fight against the Firelight. She is the one that kills him when he kind of eventually is about to sell her out to Piltover. Of course, mistake. It's that tragedy, of course, it's a mistake. He wasn't going to do it. That's what she hears. She ends up so much worse. But of course, it's not Silco is the one who does. Dies. That comes to suffering. But in the end, it is the daughter. Accidental mute there. But yes, Silco ends up suffering. Yes. Jinx suffers more. Let's go back. This one, we'll come back onto Madness in a second or two. Things. The other obvious one here, guys, is Caitlyn by very clearly a lot worse than they were in season. Caitlyn, kind, compassion, soul, sees dignity in follows in her there and trying to be better than I think, and tries to do the right thing in the right way. Season 2, she is using the knowledge of her family to gas the Undersiders using spray, which, for those who don't remember, is what ends up causing Victor's ailments and infirmities. Of course, that's an extended exposure, but the point still stands. You are literally poison gassing the undersiders in your hunt for vengeance, quest for vengeance. Another way of phrasing it. Vi joins alongside it. She goes on a giant drinking binge at the end of it all. Horrible mess. Even Lovis there. Is it Lovis? Forget his name. Begins with an L. Eventually saying, I can't hang around watching you self destroy. Uh, see in that pit fighting. And Caitlyn just gets it well. And all those jokes and memes and horrified stories of fans realizing exactly where she goes. It's a bit sad to see. Those are two prime examples. Another core tragedies, and that is, of course, madness. Characters go mad in revenge tragedies nearly invariably. In Macbeth, Lady Macbeth goes mad. She has that whole thing where she can't get the spot out of her hand. Out, damn spot, out. The old man had so much blood in him, and all those conversations. Hamlet, who feigns madness. Feigning madness counts as well. It's all over the Spanish tragedy as well. Hieronymus does it. It's a whole thing. Everyone goes. It's kind of crazy. And you can kind of go down the line. It is just invariably there in whatever revenge tragedy you care to look at. And it's very much there in Arcane too. This screenshot do it. Jinx goes mad. Now, of course, difference here is, as we've kind of already alluded to, yes, Jinx is in some ways someone looking for her own vengeance, target to be avenged upon as well by a number of people. She's also in some ways a weapon in the hands of Silco. He forges to be his will and figurehead in some ways of the great Zornite revolution and cry for independence. And doing so, she ends up going mad. She was already mentally well, very unstable, as we kind of saw. The series goes on, that decline comes through. It all comes to that head. Final episode 9 of season 1, and season 2 is that kind of attempt to come out the other side of it. Quite interesting, but it's also quite telling that, unlike a lot of Ethan revenge tragedies, where madness is sometimes a punishment, sometimes just the kind of raw emotional outpouring or that revenge leads you to. Some of that here in Arcane too, but it's also a much more of a conversation in a much more nuanced way about mental health, about the fact that Jinx is actually just quite unwell as a character. In some ways, that is partly what pushes the decision she does. It is that mental instability that leads to a lot of this could have been avoided. It was preventable. And that is part of the tragedy in and of itself. Outside of perhaps the archetypes of revenge is, well, what happens if she got help and attention and wasn't instead turned into a weapon? Silco loved her, of course, save her, or the fact that by in her anger at the death of her father in the early episodes pushes her away. You can have all of those conversations, but it's not just madness as a vehicle to vengeance. Madness in a way that is sad and questions the systems we have in place in society that lead to people who can end up breaking in such ways, and the help we could have. Tragic and sad in its own way to see someone in that position. Of course, it's not just Jinx that we see suffer with some of that madness. Again, only on episode 6. We don't know where this is going. Dear old Jace here went from being a very calm, very rational man who man of tomorrow, and ends up going on a very bizarre and unhappy adventure in a mirror to Victor, who ends up in a very harmonious place with Hextech. Jace goes on some horrible trip, possibly to the void. Who the hell knows at this point? Comes back an unknown amount of time later, absolutely scarred and traumatized by what he's experienced, to the extent where he's now on some mad quest of his own to go kill his former brother in arms, lab partner Victor, at whatever cost, and appears to have kind of lost his marbles just a touch. That is now on this single-minded journey for vengeance, and then at the end of episode 6, blows a hole in Victor, saying he needed to do it and he can't fail this time. Who knows where that's going to go, but another mad character. This one played a little bit straighter. Last one here, or at least one of the last ones. This one's a bit more niche. And I think perhaps a touch more of a stretch, but I still think it's got hints of itself within This is one of those other tropes that is very specific. Yeah, turns up it's seemingly in nearly every revenge tragedy you care to look at. It's this idea of a play within a play, or sometimes better defined as metatheatricality. Um, Hamlet, you've got that play that Hamlet puts on within Hamlet that's supposed to try and figure out whether the king, his uncle, is guilty of murdering his father. The end of the Spanish tragedy, there's a play that's put on where the fake knives are replaced with real knives, and so the murderers who were part of the play actually end up dying. So it's a whole way of getting to make sure the vengeance happens, just using a kind of facsimile of make believe in the play to make sure it seems safe and that various important people. Um, and that's often the way that meta theatricality turns up in French tragedies. But it's not always. And meta theatricality, as a kind of definition, is another one of those slightly scary literature terms. It's basically the idea of um, toying with the bounds of theatre. It's meta stuff. So the idea of breaking the wall, perhaps. The idea that the players within the play become a little bit more aware in some capacity that this is a fiction, be that by their own play within it. So then you have this kind of additional layer of, well, where does the play end and where does the new start? And all of those kind of conversations about the bounds of the story, the bounds of where things like those morals and conversations really end and where the audience itself. And we get a little less of that side of it with Arcane. And again, it is a little bit more niche. But what I will say is we do have some hits. And I want to take our eyes over to the other side of the screen because these are all clips, screenshots rather, from when Mel is going to meet up with Lest, who is the Stein Sue Shimmer person that Salo, who is the wheelchair bound counselor that Ambessa kind of manipulating on in the series. She's the one who's drawing the lines of Shimmer on his legs, and she's kind of Mel's informant within Ambessa's camp. And they meet behind the stage play because they are trying, of course, figure out what's going on behind the scenes of the setting of Piltover and Zorn. They're trying to figure out what's going on behind the scenes, and ain't that a little bit on the tiche? But on top of that, you've also got what the players on stage and have those conversations about being behind the curtains, actually behind the stage, pulling those strings in Piltover. But what's on the stage as well is important, and these are all clips of a coronation ceremony for a Demacian king, likely Jarvan III, though I'm not entirely sure. I believe it's Jarvan III, who is Jarvan IV father. Now, Jarvan IV is a character within League of Legends. He is the Prince of Demacia, and one of the major characters for Demacia in the game, and Jarvan III is the king of Demacia. Now, this is where it gets a bit interesting, because much like Noxus is pulling the strings in Piltover and Zorn, there is a long running story, theory. Jarvan III, father of Jarvan IV, ruler of Demacia, being killed and replaced by a fake, by an actor. That actor, LeBlanc, is the Black Rose. Demacia, all of the machinations and wars that is kind of building up between Demacia and Noxus, and the things that Demacia is doing in terms of their intolerance to magic and mages and the atrocities they are committing in that regard, all at the behest of the Black Rose and LeBlanc herself. May well be sitting as one of her clones, because of course, multiple places at once. She's literally executed at some points, guys, and just come back to life in another place because it's very hard to get rid of. If she's in the first place, may well, in fact, just be the reigning king of Demacia, and we just don't know it. That's on stage here, where the Noxians are trying to do something similar, where they are manipulating another city-state, another rival. Black Rose are involved again, and Mel is trying to get behind the scenes to find out what's going on. And of course, doing so perhaps leads to her being picked up by the Black Rose after this scene. Bit more of a stretch, bit more niche, but I do think this is something where it goes. And it's only episode 6, but it's there if you go looking for it, as far as my opinion. There she is again. That's the character that's doing it. Bonk. Could also just be Jarvan the Third. Who the hell knows? Last line here is violence. Lots and lots of gratuitous violence. This is the last pillar that comes into it. It's everywhere in Arcane. I don't think you have to be hard for it. Jinx versus Vi. Sevica blowing up the Yordle guy with the extendable legs and the giant sword arm. Dearest Zornite Chainsaw Parent looking for vengeance against Jace. Jinx versus Vander. After Vander has just murdered a load of Zornites who are trying to escape, who were his people once upon a time, who's just gone absolutely mad on blood. Aisha. About to sacrifice herself and all the people around her in order to try and stop what's going on, and everyone dead. And that is one of the things with revenge tragedies. At the end, nearly everyone ends up dead, and the violence is gratuitous, it is bloody, it is often quite honestly shocking. And I think we've seen a fair amount of that in Arcane as well. I don't think we've necessarily crossed pale too much, but I think emotionally, at the very least, the violence has been pretty staggering. I don't think I would have to fight many people hard on that. But that in mind, we have had a look at all of those pillars of what makes a revenge tragedy. And I think it's fair to say that Arcane has been hitting pretty much every single one of them. Not being subtle, guys. The way that it is using and wielding dramatic convention and dramatic history in order to build the framework within the show work, which is tied to the likes of Shakespeare, Thomas Kyd, and Marlowe, Seneca, other great revenge stories of the ages. But I don't think it's fair to say that it's just a revenge tragedy. Already during this video, you should hopefully have had a bit of an idea about why that isn't. But let's have a talk about some of the ways in which Arcane does subvert. As we can see there already, this is the big family hug. Wouldn't have that in a revenge. Happen as they die in some ways, perhaps they have, but you wouldn't get this moment of harmony, really. Well, that, of course, Vander's letter. Effort made to reconcile, find ways forward, don't lead to the death of them. Actually, vengeance can be held off at the past, that you can still hold your back. That's where I want to start with this. The Arcane is actually preoccupied in a lot of ways with redemption and arresting the devolving spiral of destruction and vengeance, as much as it is that side cycle of vengeance. One atrocity to the quest for justice that turns to vengeance at costs, leads to the other side of the fence suffering another one of those losses, retaliation in kind, and that escalation, that spiral into insanity and madness is it's something that we do very much see in Arcane, but there are attempts consistently to arrest it, to find ways out of it. Whether or not they succeed, matter. But that preoccupation is unusual. I hope in some ways that we see some of those. Other side of this as well. Generally speaking, in a revenge tragedy, it is very obvious which side is the avenger, which side is the target of that vengeance. Macbeth is the villain. He is the target of. He is the one. Hamlet, very obviously, it's the uncle who's the target of the vengeance. Hamlet, who is the person who gives up so much to make it happen. Go look at the Spanish tragedy. It is Hieronymus who sets up this great fight in the Spanish court to try and get vengeance at all costs, and everyone dead. And you can go down this list to see exactly where it's up. But it's very obvious who is who and what is what. That's not true in Arcane. Many people will be mutable in roles they take. They might wear a lot of hats at once. It might be like Jinx, who is weapon and target of vengeance and avenger, and Caitlyn, who's in the same space, and where Vi fits in with that. And Silco, and how he starts as this Machiavellian villain and decides that actually doesn't want that for itself anymore and actually is um, preoccupied with trying to rehabilitate in some ways as well. And that is somewhat undercut by the fact that the weight of his sins and actions still up to him. And you can go down that list. One of the things Arcane's so interesting is, well, Piltover and Zorn have bloodied each other's noses quite a lot, and that line as to who is right and who is wrong continually shifts back and forth. It's camp, even if there is a lot of blood that has now smeared itself on the sides of that side. Have that conversation again about where Noxus fits. Well, the long and short of it, there is not clear cut, and I don't think B adds a lot more power as a result, and a lot less certainty what would be safe ground. Um, last one. Revenge tragedies only end one way. That's with principal characters. Vengeance satisfied. What is left, a lot of emptiness and a mixed bag of justice, I think, fair to say, in a slight understatement. As of this video, a lot of dead people. Echo's a thing. His power in game is to rewind time. See where that goes. See any of that in Arcane. We've still got 3 episodes to go again. Episode 6, where see where. Hopefully, maybe, just maybe. That in mind, it is the bibliography for people who want an idea about whether they would like to read some more stuff. Okay. This is, of course, for people who actually care. I expect most of you won't even bother, but these are some really good places to look. So first off, of course, Thomas Kyd. Go read the Spanish tragedy. It is hilarious. It's ridiculous. It is quintessential French tragedy. You'll see all of those pillars we talked about earlier on in there. Shakespeare in general. Titus Andronicus, the one I've highlighted. 5.1 atrocities. 5.1 atrocities. Something like every 19. Can't quite remember. Hamlet, Macbeth, and Merchant of Venice all fit in quite well. Recognize people Silco quite well, likes of Shylock, Machiavellian villains who are actually quite charismatic and appealing. It's worth reading Shakespeare in general, where Arcane is getting its root from. Similarly, Tamburlaine by Christopher Marlowe. It's the other stage hit alongside the Spanish tragedy. Kicked off a lot of that golden age of the English theatre. Great book. It's pretty wild. Lots of death and glory. Lots of madness. It's not aged that well. Be advised, some of these books are products of their time, and Tamburlaine's attitudes, shall we say, to certain parts of the world are not particularly appropriate. But there we go. That's part of the part of what makes an interesting monster. I think it would be unfair not to talk about revenge tragedies. If we talk about Senecan tragedies, Thyestes there is where Thomas Kyd got a lot of his influences from. It's where the revenge tragedies kind of kicked off. The prototype for it all is back in the Roman Republic with Seneca the Younger. Oedipus and Hercules also worth the read on that front as well. But Thyestes, it's where there's a giant cannibal feast scene, guys. It's bloody ridiculous. Grim as hell. It's more of a gory horror than necessarily a revenge tragedy. There's less tragedy involved, I would argue, but it's still quite entertaining. Similarly, Ovid's Metamorphosis, more on the tragedy end, more on the way fate works, and all kinds of thing. And the last one, of course, Aristotle, Poetics. It's cool. It's where a lot of Greek and tragedy gets its roots, and where tragedy gets its roots. There's your reading list. Go have fun, guys. And I hit the wrong button. Thank you all for listening. It's in a long video. Thank you for sticking with it if you got all the way to the end. Like, subscribe, follow. Follow me on Initialized Cats pretty much everywhere. That includes YouTube, where you're probably watching this, Instagram, TikTok, Twitter, BlueSky as well. I'll be under Initialized. Just make sure you follow. Thank you all for that. But thank you for listening to my Timo talk. Till next time, guys. Bye-bye.